Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final night of our Afghanistan Symposium 20 years later. Hoping I'm okay on the screen right now for folks that are watching. But I just want to thank everybody who's joined us this past week. My name is Omar Aziz. I am the director of the Middle Eastern Student Center at the University of California, Riverside. We are an identity-based center, identity-affirming space that supports Middle Eastern SWANA students at the campus of UC Riverside. And we are so excited to be able to do this program with alongside the Middle Eastern Islamic Studies Department at UC Riverside as well, who have been supporting us. And we're very lucky to have folks here and our panelists today. So today wraps up the symposium. So we started day one looking at the history of Afghanistan and sort of what were some of the recent events and things that occurred which sort of led to the US occupation in 2001. On Tuesday, we talked about the culture and the media and how that's shaped the people of Afghanistan, how that's shaped the resistance within the country, how that's shaped identity in many ways that, music, culture, journalism, how Afghans are represented were all part of that conversation on Tuesday. Yesterday, we spent some time looking more deeply into the impacts of the occupation and how the people of Afghanistan were directly impacted by the US-led war. And today, we had our opening keynote from Dr. Iman Ahmad Siddiq, who spoke to us about the diaspora. So we're talking more about folks and the Afghans who are who have left Afghanistan, and as many know, in the past few months, we have an incredible influx of Afghans who have come to the United States in particular. And so we'll take a deeper dive into the experiences of the refugees and folks who leave Afghanistan, and what we can expect from them upon return, and also looking at what are some of the efforts being made by Afghan-led organizations in the US and how they are supporting and working for the Afghan people and helping with some of that transition and advocacy. I want to encourage you all to please make sure you're engaging with us, engaging with the content. So please make sure that you are commenting on the YouTube page, asking questions there. We'll have time for questions from the audience at the end. So please make sure you ask those questions. Please use, we have a couple hashtags, AFGUCR, excuse me, AFGUCR, or UCR AFG, and then AFG Symposium. So we'll put those hashtags there, but please use those on social media to help promote this event and to help us with kind of collecting some of the really great comments and quotes that have come across in this past week. Also follow us, the Middle Eastern Student Center, on social media at MESC UCR, and you can check all the latest updates for what we're doing. Wanted to just sort of acknowledge that today is actually the 20th anniversary of the U.S. occupation, and so when the first rockets and the military attacks first came 20 years ago from the United States, and so it's we wanted to make sure that this whole week was spent really thinking about and hearing from Afghan voices about Afghanistan and how this occupation has shaped Afghanistan and also shaped us here in the U.S. and abroad. And so with that being said, I also wanted to, last thing is to mention is that we are looking to support scholars to come to the University of California, Riverside. So we do have a crowdfunding campaign to bring students to come to UC Riverside and teach and learn and be educated here and also continue their research here. So we will put the link for that also in the YouTube. We ask you all to please donate. We have a $100,000 goal that we are seeking, and we have a $100,000 match from the university. So if we can meet that goal, your donations will be doubled. So we ask you all to please donate generously. Please share that information and spread that widely. And I will go ahead and begin by introducing our panel for tonight as we discuss the diaspora and the community. So I'll go ahead and start with our moderator for tonight, Dr. Iman Ahmad Siddiq, who will be moderating, who gave an excellent keynote today, talking a little bit about her research and what sort of we see in the diaspora here in America. So Dr. Iman Ahmad Siddiq explores how recent immigrant communities integrate into the United States. She primarily studies Muslim Americans and their relationship to citizenship as an identifier of belonging and emphasizing the role of political status. Dr. Ahmad Siddiq conducted the first in-depth qualitative study of the Afghan-American community. I'll go ahead and bring Dr. Siddiq on here. And then we have Arash Azizadeh from Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. Arash Azizadeh is a writer, photographer, and community-based organizer in Los Angeles. The child of Afghan refugees, Arash is deeply committed to social justice and building communities. He co-founded the Afghan Diaspora for Equality and Progress, or ADEPT, in 2016, which is aimed at elevating and empowering change makers within our community. This year, he also co-launched the Afghans for a Better Tomorrow campaign in response to President Biden's withdrawal announcement, and is currently leading rapid response efforts in the wake of the crisis for Afghans in country and beyond. Then we have Nadia Hashimi. Nadia Hashimi is a pediatrician turned internationally best-selling author. Her novels for adults and children are inspired by the people and history of Afghanistan and have been translated into 16 languages. She's a member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, Afghan-American Foundation, Montgomery County Commission on Health, and serves on the board of several nonprofit organizations. Originally from New York, she lives with her husband and 4 children in Potomac, Maryland. And next we have Qais Alami from Loma Linda University. So Dr. Alami is a global health researcher with a focus on understanding the social and psychological challenges endured by populations affected by political violence. His research includes studies of refugees and asylum seekers, which have contributed to expanding basic knowledge about the unmet socioeconomic needs of resettlement communities here in the US and abroad, and how various social factors add to the burden of their adjustment and challenges. So thank you all for joining tonight's panel, and I will go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Sadiq, who will be moderating tonight's discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Omar. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with so many amazing folks that we do have here. And the format is going to be pretty simple. I'll be asking a few questions, giving our speakers a little bit of time to have a discussion, and at the end we'll have more of a joint conversation. But definitely please do comment on the side on the YouTube and ask questions as we go along, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end to get to those as well. So I wanted to get started with you, Dr. Alami. Can you talk a little bit about the unique challenges that Afghan refugees face upon entering the U.S. as refugees? I touched upon the experience of the diaspora and the history of the resettlement of the community this morning, but I think your lens in particular can really shed light on what are the challenges that refugees have as Afghana in the U.S., given that status as refugees themselves.
Thank you, Iman. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay. So, generally speaking, I mean, if you look at the challenges that refugees face in general, I mean, non-Afghan refugees, what you see is a lot of the effects of pre-migration traumas and post-resettlement stressors that really affect refugees. And what I mean by pre-migration traumas is all the different atrocities that people have been exposed to and have witnessed before actually resettling in places like the US. And the transit experiences, the experience of traveling from abruptly from one's country to a third country of resettlement like the US, that can be traumatic in and of itself. The fact that people are losing everything in the process, their home, their culture, their way of life, that right there is a source of trauma for individuals. So it's not just trauma is not just limited to the effects of war atrocities, but it's really rooted in loss and then culture shock when people resettle in this country. So this is generally what a lot of refugees face. But what makes Afghans unique is that, from what I've read and from what I've studied and researched, is that the issue for Afghans is that distress or the resettlement experience is highly gendered, in that men and women experience stressors and react to stressors in different ways, right? So, for instance, I'll give you an example. So men deal with a lot of status loss, especially men who are highly educated that come to this country and lose that status. So they lose their authority status in the household, and and the research shows to regain that status, I mean, they resort to things like domestic violence, and then that raises or gives rise to a whole host of different issues, family conflicts, intergenerational conflicts, and whatnot. So I think the fact that, I mean, Afghans and share many, similar experiences with other refugee groups, but what makes them unique is the fact that the issues for Afghans are highly gendered and they're highly influenced by acculturation-related stressors, right? And the new thing, the new phenomenon that's sort of emerging here that my research is showing is that, the fact that they are Muslim, similar to other refugee groups, but unlike many other refugee groups, Afghans are Muslim minorities. And that right there, I mean, we see, my research has shown, and other researchers in this area, I think yourself, Iman, you've observed the fact that, being a Muslim minority in this contentious socio-political climate is not healthy for adjustment, especially for refugees. So discrimination rooted in the fact that they're Muslim minorities, in addition to the experience of resettlement being so gendered, which raises a number of issues both at the family level and the socioeconomic level, are very unique to Afghans, I think.
Yeah. What does your research tell you about the previous waves, and what do you anticipate to be the biggest differences and challenges that'll be faced by the most recent influx of Afghans? So if we think about the new group that's coming in versus the folks that migrated in the 80s and 90s, do you think that there'll be differences or different sort of challenges that are going to be faced, or how do you compare those two groups when you're considering them?
That's a good question, and I think more research needs to be done with the new SIV populations or the new group that's resettling here in the U.S. to really determine that. But what I expect to see is that this new group, akin to the first wave of refugees who arrived here in the 80s, will have, if nothing is done for these individuals, will face really extreme socioeconomic problems, and that is because we don't have a way here in the U.S. We don't have any way of recognizing people's degrees and credentials that are earned abroad. And what I'm understanding about this SIV group is that some of them are highly educated. There's a high proportion who are educated, who have credentials, and we need to do a better job of we as a country, need to do a better job of recognizing their degrees and credentials. And if you compare outcomes here, mental health outcomes here of Afghans, you compare them with places like Sweden and Canada, Afghans in Sweden and in Canada are doing much better. Why? Because they have integration programs that offer services for refugees who have graduate degrees to get them integrated into the job market and whatnot. So Afghans there are doing much better. But to go back to the question of what the research has shown in terms of the previous waves, generally what we have seen, and I think what we will continue to see, is that mental health problems are pervasive. It's a pervasive problem within our community. It's highly complex. There's no one size fits all solution to the issue. And when I say mental health problems, I'm not saying people are disordered. What I'm saying is that people are in distress. There's a difference there. When you think of a disorder, you think of schizophrenia, but that's not the issue here. These are not biologically based problems that people are facing. They're rooted in socioeconomic challenges. So I think, to really get at the heart of the issue, and my view of it may be somewhat biased. A clinician might very well disagree with me, and that's fine. But what I think more needs to be done is that these SIVs, the new wave of individuals, have high expectations, to be integrated into the job market here because of their credentials, and we need to do more in that regard for them. Yeah.
Just on that point, how can the diaspora that's already been here be most helpful to the most recent arrivals, in your opinion, then?
As I mentioned, the issues or the solutions are, they're still being under investigation, right? More research needs to be done in this area to determine that, and it's highly complex. But I think, to answer your question, I think based on what I've read and what I've researched and what I've heard, when I say I've researched, these are the narratives from Afghans themselves, is that, we need communities that are, that are strongly tied together, right? Mm-hmm. And we have community bonds. We have strong bonds in the community that, which can essentially do a lot to welcome these new arrivals, right?
Yeah.
And make them feel wanted, right? And the other thing is this can really instill hope in people, and hope is a remedy for a lot of problems in Afghanistan. Research shows that, and hope is really rooted in, it's a very important cultural context. Hope, arzu, right? Hope is a very important cultural context in that it's tied to so many different cultural factors, like people's faith and their family bonds and their morals and whatnot, and their honor. So I think what we need to do is just come together as a community, make these individuals feel welcome, and which can ultimately instill hope for these people in their minds that things will be better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it a lot of the things that you're mentioning, it takes me back to our conversation this afternoon that it's saddening in a way that we don't have the institutionalized forces with the government or even refugee resettlement agencies to have an easier integration process. But then when we think about how new these agencies and these policies themselves are, I guess it's not surprising in some ways, even though we like to think of ourselves as the United States of America as the forefront on many fronts. It seems that we have a lot of work to do as a community, whether it be the diaspora or even non-Afghans. I believe, from what you're saying, there's a lot of support that can be given from many different angles because we simply don't have those structures in place through our social institutions at this time.
That's right. And if I can add some more to that real quick, I think, from what from what I've come to understand through my investigations of the Afghan community here in the San Diego area is that, and this is no surprise to anyone who's listening, that mental health or mental health help seeking is highly stigmatized. And I think we need to do a better job of destigmatizing or lifting or preventing the stigma of mental disorders or mental health problems. I hate to use the word disorder, but mental health problems or emotional distress, and push the idea that, seeking help is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I don't know how likely people are how likely Afghans are to actually seek help here in the United States for their problems, for stress or whatnot. But it's just another step forward, I suppose, and could possibly mitigate the challenges that our community is facing.
And I'm assuming you're saying that based on the fact that, from your observations, there's already a challenge within the diaspora that's here in seeking out those sources, so you don't anticipate that it'll get much easier with the newer community members.
Yeah, I don't anticipate that, no.
Yeah, it's a challenge that I hope work on destigmatizing. It's an uphill battle. Sure. I guess you want to open up the conversation so that we three can talk a little bit. But first, I wanted to get some insights from Orashjan and Nadia Jan. Having heard Dr. Alami, what do you think about his observations and the challenges for the incoming community?
Do you want to? I can start.
Yeah, please.
Sure. So I think that a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in the previous generations are going to be echoed in this generation of arrivals, right? And it's not like we've had one generation and now this is a new generation. There were several generations in between. So we keep having cycles of arrivals that come in different waves and different periods because of different sets of conditions that happen in Afghanistan. So with each generation, it seemed like we learned a little bit. We maybe started to build a little bit more. But this particular wave of arrivals is very different in that it's truly a wave. And the circumstances under which this cohort has come is with a lot of attention internationally and domestically here in the United States. And as horrific as all of it has been, what's giving me some hope is that it has mobilized our community here. So I think one of the things that's going to be a bit different with this wave of arrivals is that we are a bit more intentional in building some connections with the folks who are coming, right? We already have people from within our community who are going well out of their way to either volunteer or get involved in advocacy or gather donations or just looking for ways. I mean, how many people have signed up to welcome children into their homes, without knowing, how many children are out there? This didn't really happen in the past, 30 years because there wasn't this dramatic of a need for us to kind of come together. So I think it's really a galvanizing moment for our community. How do we solidify that? How do we turn that into something that's real, that persists and doesn't just, float away when the crisis kind of fades away from our minds? And so those same sets of challenges that they're facing, how do we, on a more, foundational way, take a look at how do we network with each other to make sure that we let each other know when there are jobs that are available, right? How do we recruit for one another? How do we advocate for ourselves together communally for our population? Because if we're doing it in bits and pieces, it doesn't really get anywhere. How do we address the needs of the children of the next generation? How do we, talk to each other and say, this is what I did for my children. I enrolled them in these classes. I did these after school activities, and just, empower one another. And a lot of it, I think, is just our community kind of overcoming a very private nature that we have, where we kind of, we hole up into our homes and we engage with each other in very, very distinct ways at public events, at public affairs. But then at the end of the day, we kind of try to keep secluded. But really, the best thing for all of us, and I think that, the Afghan population now is really realizing it's all up to us. Whatever we want our story to be, it is going to be up to us. No one's going to come in and save us. No one ever has come in and saved us, right? So whether we're talking about Afghanistan or we're talking about here, we're talking about the next generation of Afghans, it's going to have to be us that does the changing of the narrative. And we do it collectively and we do it intentionally.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I'm veering a little bit from my pre-written questions just because you brought up a great point that I think I'm a little curious, Dr. Alimi, maybe you would have some more insights on this. The private nature of the community that you just mentioned, Nadia John, is that something that you feel is part of the trauma experience, perhaps? Because as many of us know, with the history of what many Afghans went through the Soviet invasion and all of that, it was a very difficult time for folks who may have, had trust betrayed or their name on a list or something like that. So they want to keep certain information private, and it develops into a culture of privacy. Or do you think that it's just a difference in American versus Afghan culture in general? I know it's kind of hard to make a generalization like that, but it's interesting because what you were talking about, Nadia John, is something I observed in my research as well, that we have folks we're a lower middle class community overall. And oftentimes it's that we have college educated individuals who find it difficult to take that education and apply it to the career paths that they desire to attain that level of position that they could as the same as their peers. And they don't have the same sort of networks and things. So it takes them longer to get to those places or to access those sorts of networks to be able to get to that place. But to the question of privacy, Dr. Alimi, if you can maybe elaborate a little bit of that, the private nature of the community at times, is that something that you feel is a trauma response, or is it just a different cultural norm?
You're asking me, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to be sure. Sorry. It's funny. I actually observed this phenomenon too when I was doing my dissertation research several years ago down in the San Diego area. Is that despite, of course, being an Afghan, being part of the community, showing my face at the local Afghan mosque, if you will, people were very hesitant to get involved in research studies where, especially in situations where I, want to visit them in their homes and, ask them sort of personal questions about, their experiences, in Afghanistan, or whatever. So I found this to be very common with a lot of people, that they're very cautious in who they allow to get near them and to ask them such invasive questions. So, but it's really hard to say whether that's a new cultural norm phenomenon or it's just something innate about Afghans. I don't know. It's hard to say, but they can be very so they don't trust outsiders much. Yeah.
I think it's a level of awareness of a unique challenge that maybe is helpful for the broader community to understand that it's not personal, it's not you, it's me, sort of situation. But picking back up on the larger conversation with what you were just talking about, Nadia John, what are the highest priority objectives that your organization, Afghan-American Foundation, is working towards? And then I'll ask the same question to you, Arash, after Nadia John shares her perspective.
Sure. So, our organization is, we have 4 components to the mission of our organization. And one is civic engagement and advocacy for the Afghan-American community. The second is really helping to identify the priorities for our community. And then third is bridge building among the different the existing organizations that we've had, coast to coast. And then finally, to strengthen the United States' relationship, that bilateral relationship between Afghanistan and the United States. And, obviously our exactly what we've been doing and how we've been doing and what we've been advocating for has changed dramatically from, the end of last year into this summer and what's going on. So, what we've really been talking about, so much of what we've done is really crisis response, where we're taking a look at everything from, evacuations that we're involved in on a personal level, on an organizational level, to what's happening at the safe havens, to the unaccompanied children, to the resettlement phases, and to advocacy on matters like temporary protective status, where we've collaborated with other organizations and just stated that this is something that should be enforced for evacuees and parolees so that we don't have detentions or deportations. We've looked at women and girls in particular with the new arrivals as well and advocated on that point. So, but what we have to do now is really flex from that crisis response to more institutionalizing our priorities and pushing forward in ways that are not just reactive to what has happened now, but really towards an empowering of the community in general. So, our priorities are going to have to shift relative to what the landscape is, but we should always be dedicated to those 4 components of our mission.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that perspective. I think for folks who may not have been with us this afternoon, a lot of these organizations are newer. If you think about, something like the NAACP, who's been around for decades, a lot of the civic engagement that's happened has really been post-Trump era or during the Trump era and kind of onwards. So it's not a lot of time to institutionalize in the way I'm sure that you all would like to, but it is very admirable and amazing to witness the kind of work you still have done thus far, because it's to be a community that is in crisis and then bear the burden of being the social services and the network to assist in that. It's a very difficult and unique sort of challenge, the emotional burden that lies within there. Arashjan, if you could also chime in, I'd be curious to know, what are the highest priority objectives that your organization, the ones that you're involved with, are working towards?
Thank you first of all, to Riverside for hosting what has been kind of a unique event. I don't think I've seen so many prestigious Afghan names come together. So I wanted to give a quick shout out for putting all of us in the same space. In terms of the work we're doing in our organization, I think we are still trying to pull out every day from the rapid response mode, which we are still kind of in. We're doing triage, we're doing rapid response, and trying to figure out, how can we help people in the now and today. But if we pull back a little bit, I think there's 3 silos or buckets that we are kind of focusing on, which is Afghanistan itself.
From the perspective of Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. Is that correct?
Yes. From Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, we're thinking about it in 3 different ways, which is first, in country Afghanistan. There's 38 million people who still live in Afghanistan. So how do we make Afghanistan still livable for the 38 million people there, which is a complex endeavor and probably the hardest task that's in front of us. Then we're also thinking about the continued evacuations, people who find themselves in 3rd countries, people who are sitting or trying to transition to 3rd countries. We have folks in Albania and Macedonia, and what does that look like for them? And then there's obviously the part for the almost 100,000 Afghans who are now in this country. I think what we witnessed in these past few weeks is actually just the failure of government, failure of institutions. And when governments and institutions fail, what happens is that communities have to rise up and do their job instead. And that's what we've all collectively been attempting to do. You know, we've been privately chartering flights. We've been trying to tell people how to get visas. We're trying to get services to people who have newly arrived to military bases. We are getting them close because there is no larger network. There is no larger social services set up in the United States in the way, for example, that happens in Western Europe or Canada. And so we're thinking about this in the long term. And we, for example, know that the government that failed us in August after the fall of Kabul will not randomly pop up again and be of service to all these Afghans who are arriving, or the Afghans who remain in third countries or remain in Afghanistan. We find ourselves in a very unique moment, and we are trying to build collective grassroots community power, because that's where our power lies, I think, and that's where we can make a material impact for the roughly 100,000 people who will be integrating into American society, who will need help with housing, who will be moving to places like Virginia and California and New York, where housing, as we all know, is not very cheap. They will need assistance with finding jobs and careers and education. And so I think the best way for the Afghan diaspora here in the United States to remedy that is to build power and to dedicate themselves in the long term.
To follow up with what you were just saying in terms of building power and grassroots, how is your organization building bridges between organizations to achieve these objectives? Or is that, I've witnessed some of the things that have been happening, but I'd love to kind of catch up everybody else on the interconnectedness of a lot of organizations and how that has been leveraging or assisting some of your larger goals.
Yeah, I think within this moment of crisis, it's kind of erased some of the divides that we have, actually, which has been useful. We've come together because we all have the same goal, and it's happening in a moment of crisis. While at the same time, we're also realizing that we are trying to, for example, in the month of August, we're trying to get people to the airport and get them on some kind of flight to get them out. But in the long term, going back to thinking about the long-term needs of people, the long-term needs of 38 million people. What does humanitarian aid look like? What does jobs and housing look like for Afghans who are going to be in weird places that perhaps we're not used to? That can only, I think, be achieved by building coalitions. That can only be built by making friends and allies and collaborators, not just within our own Afghan-American community, but also with other communities, other marginalized diaspora communities. So, when we look at what's happening on the border with Haitian immigrants, in the end, there is no difference between folks trying to cross the border originally from Haiti, then to Mexico, and then to the US, because those people are seeking safety, refuge, and human dignity very much in the same way, and also caused by the same causes of U.S. imperialism, of U.S. foreign policy. And so I think when you look at the issues that are caused by the United States in this intersectional way, the remedy to that is also to build a network that is intersectional, that builds bridges with other impacted, marginalized communities to uplift one another. And that's where I think our collective strength can come from, not just now, but in the medium and long term.
Yeah, and I guess on that topic of coalition building and working with different forces, I know there's multiple different approaches that individuals and groups may take, and I guess to ask this from the perspective of someone who's worked at a bureaucratic level myself, I understand that sometimes effective change is a slower process that has to be done within. I've also observed, from what you're talking about, Oroshan, the grassroots sort of movements and the power of large groups of people and gathering. And I guess I'll start with you, Nadia John, because it's a bit of a unique take that AAF is doing, in the sense that we haven't had an Afghan civic organization take this approach until AAF came along, I believe. And so how do you approach working with or alongside government institutions who may have been seen by some as responsible for the instability that existed within Afghanistan. Often marginalized communities, including Afghan, can be critical or hesitant of such collaboration. So how do you navigate that? Because I can imagine it's a difficult space to walk that fine line, and especially with a community that can tend to be very vocal about their opinions sometimes.
And we have every right to be vocal about what's going on, about what's happened, right? And we should be vocal. We should be honest. We need to be in a position where we can acknowledge what is really going on, because, the second you start really dancing around it, then you've lost attention and you've lost your focus. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there's work to be done, and how can we accomplish this, right? Like, how do we get to our goals? And that might mean that you have to sit down at tables that you don't enjoy, knowing what has happened at those tables, knowing the decisions that have been made and what has transpired in those rooms before, that you may not be in love with the idea of sitting down with this particular agency or these entities or these individuals. But if we want to get to a place where we can make some movement and be heard and be represented, then we've got to be involved in the conversations. The other thing is acknowledging that I think that there's a difference between people and policy. Yeah. Like, if we take, I don't love the military industrial complex at all, right? I understand the damage that it has done, not just in Afghanistan, but globally, and how toxic it is. But that is a thing. And then there is, this layer of our country here, of the United States, which is, the defense world, and that is an integral part of the country. So how do we start to move what that organization looks like what that layer of our government looks like? And we can do part of it in terms of, protests and vocalizing. And then part of it has to come from working within the organizations themselves, right? It's like sitting down, changing minds, and actually engaging with people. And then understanding, when I go to a meeting where there's a group of, representatives from veterans organizations, like, they're not my enemy, right? Those are individuals who are also a victim of policies, of misguided decisions. And so I think, we have to, on a granular level, work with people where we believe that we can build allies, where we can move the needle a little bit into the direction that we want. And then institutionally, we've got to work from without, but also from within.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that perspective. And something you said stuck out to me, the question of how do we get to our goals? When you asked that, it made me think, Dr. Alami, you probably have the best perspective. When we're thinking about these larger goals that we have, these policy changes we want to make, these institutional structures we want to establish for the community, what are things that we should be considering? How should we be considerate of the new community? What are delicacies that we may want to be attuned to make sure that we do this in the right way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that what's worked with other populations, vulnerable populations here in the U.S., is partnerships between academic institutions and community-based organizations or communities in general, and thereby you can hear based on community member narratives as to what their needs are, instead of being in a position of authority and just dictating and assuming that certain people need certain things, right? So I think it involves, and my bias is doing research, of course, because I'm a researcher, but I think this will really involve going to doing qualitative, in-depth interviews. I'm using these research terms here, in-depth interviews with our community members, our diaspora community, and asking them what made it harder or easier for you to resettle and adjust in the US. Not just those individuals who were settled here in the 80s and 90s, but maybe recent SIVs that came here maybe in 2005, 2006 under the SIV scheme. That was 15 years ago or so, right? So what have they done to adjust, and what has made it easy for them to adjust? So doing research and just understanding the needs of people from their own perspectives rather than just assuming that we know what's good for individuals, I think is a good start.
Yeah. I mean, I know it sounds basic, but it's honestly something that is a monumental concept of going beyond hearing people, but actually listening to them, and taking the time for that. I wanted to pose this question to you too, Arash, getting back to this, how do we get to our goals, that larger idea, and asking the same thing that I asked to Nadia. How do you approach working with or alongside government institutions who may have been seen as responsible for the instability that existed within Afghanistan, and often marginalized communities, including Afghana, can be critical of such collaborations? So how do you navigate that? Because I know every organization takes a different sort of angle on things, and it's good to see, I guess, a bit of the diversity that exists here.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that question, and it's probably better formulated by you than it is in my head. But I think I've been thinking about that specifically these past 7 weeks, because the structures that are in place right now, which are fascist, I think we're all seeing what was happening in the United States these past few years. They are right-wing, they're white supremacist in nature, and it informs a lot of these other structures that we take place in. These capitalistic structures that make up our day jobs. It makes up what the refugee resettlement organizations looks like, or what the nonprofit world looks like. And so, what's at the root of our work is this abolitionist mindset. We want to create something else. That's where our names, Afghans for Better Tomorrow, comes from. We are trying to replace whatever exists in its current form that is more ethical, that is creates a world for these newly arrived folks, for example, to not have to relive through their trauma or have any issues finding jobs or housing, so they can have access to mental health services. Because in this United States that I know, that is not really destigmatized or a service that is offered. And so that is being challenged because I'm working with veterans groups. I'm in contact with Defense Department officials, right? Because in that very moment of crisis, I am trying to help evacuate vulnerable and at-risk Afghans, journalists, members of the LGBTQ community, Hazara and Shia members of Afghanistan's community, SIVs, and other, just a large variety of groups. So in that moment, I found myself on like August 18th or 19th thinking about this kind of deeply, because all of a sudden I'm working with former special forces because they're good at organizing these kinds of things, and I'm not. I bring another, it's not really up to a community organizer to try to figure out how to charter flights and those type of things. While at the same time, I think we do have to, once we move out of a moment of crisis, I think we have to be very critical. I think we have an obligation, actually, not just to ourselves, but for the Afghans that are there in country still, the 38 million people, and roughly 100,000 new people that are here, because the structures that are currently in place are responsible for the pain and misery, the trauma that Dr. Alami talks about. These structures that are in place, the United States and all these other institutions, they have caused this. They are partially responsible for this. So I always bring it back to seeing that those two young Afghan boys who try to cling on to a military plane, that was caused by these institutions. That was caused by white supremacy, and that's what caused by the United States government. And that's why we have to inherently remain very critical of how we align ourselves. And I think it's very healthy as a community for us to be asking these questions, and maybe we work in tandem in different ways. I see my job and our job as community organizers who want to create this new structure. Our job is to agitate. So when we are seeking mental health services for new Afghans, or actually a legal pathway, because that doesn't exist, for example, it's one of the things we are deeply worried about. Okay, so now they are here, but they are sitting on military bases, actually probably spending time with the same people that spent occupying Afghanistan for 20 years, right? So how do we pull away from that and say, how do we get the forces that control what funding looks like for Afghans who will be integrating into American society. How do we agitate for them to listen to our demands? And our demands are right now 200 different things, I think, including humanitarian aid money going back to Afghanistan. It's things like TPS status, so that Afghans are not deported, some type of legislation that ensures that Afghans have a pathway to legal status. And that's why I think our like fights are linked in the way I had mentioned earlier. You know, like there's people getting arrested today here in Los Angeles purposefully. Civil disobedience is occurring in the streets of Los Angeles for communities that have been here for decades. And our new friends and community members just arrived here just a few weeks ago.
No, thank you. I appreciate both what you and Nadia John have mentioned, because there's a level of transparency and self-reflectiveness about not only your individual roles, but the organization, their missions, the intentionality behind it all that I find very refreshing, because it demonstrates the sincerity in both approaches that are very much necessary. And I guess if we're thinking about the overall picture, you know, zooming out to this conference, the intention here, and our community looking forward, what do you think? And I know this is such a broad question, but what does the future look like for the Afghan diaspora in the U.S.? And I know we touched upon how can we provide support for it, but if there's, you know, we're not a monolith necessarily, but if we're thinking about our greatest strengths and our greatest challenges, I think we can also think about, you know, addressing those and thinking about what does the future look like for us in thinking about those things. So I'll just go down in order of who's right next to me. I'll start with Dr. Alimi, go to Orash, and then Nadia John. If you guys want to just take like a minute or two briefly to discuss that huge question.
Okay, so in thinking about what the future looks like for the Afghan diaspora in the U.S., well, you know, I will say that you know, most immigrant and refugee communities, most individuals end up doing fine. They end up doing well. Okay, and I'm very optimistic that most of our brothers and sisters from Afghanistan will adjust fine. You know, but you know, as a researcher, and you know, as a researcher who does studies to, you know, inform clinical practice, you know, we want to make this process as seamless as possible and as painless as possible, right? By finding, you know, based on Afghan refugees' own terms, what their needs are, basically. So I think there's so many things to consider in ensuring their wellness, and you know, it's not just about PTSD-related traumas, but it's about their economic adjustment and facilitating or finding ways of ensuring that adjustment takes place as soon as possible, right? And as seamless as possible. And then the other thing is, we live in a very polarized political climate. And I mentioned earlier that Afghans are obviously Muslim minorities in this country. And you can expect a lot more studies, and that will show that, you know, there is lots of stress associated with being discriminated against. And we've seen that using census data, big data sets. Actually, we can infer this from big data sets like the census that show us that Afghans are doing far worse economically than other refugee groups. And part of the reason is because of discrimination and racism and whatnot that they face, right? So these are things that future research will have to look out for, is discrimination and racism within our community, or that's being projected against our community, I should say. You know, I tend to be optimistic, and I'm hoping that, you know, most people end up do well, and but there's a lot of work to be done to get there.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, like you said, that part about racism, for again, just trying to catch up folks who may not have been around for some different parts of our conversations. It's something that exists whether or not you're a practicing Muslim. Even the atheists Afghans in my study face that same issue because of the nature of how religion and culture are so intertwined in the almost feel like it's a part of their genetic DNA that you cannot detach from it. And the nature of racism in this country, it's indiscriminate. It's going to hit you whether you want it to or not. You can't just change your name and walk away and completely abandon everything you feel as a part of who you are to avoid that. So thank you for that perspective. I want to go down the line next to Arash too. If you want to tell me a little bit about what do you think the future looks like for the Afghan diaspora in the U.S.?
Yeah, I would like to second Dr. Alimi's point. You know, like I do think it's optimistic. Just look at this panel, for example, or look at this panel the past few days. You know, we are all either refugees, children of refugees. We are products of displacement, and we are here. I think playing, at least I like to think we are playing constructive roles in society and within our community. And I would say, you know, how successful this story becomes, because I think it's also nothing short of a miracle that roughly 100,000 Afghans just entered the United States, considering this anti-refugee climate, this polarized political world that we live in, considering the election we had last year, the 2 years before that, and 4 years before that. And I think the success of these newly arrived folks is really dependent on how the Afghan diaspora and friends outside of our diaspora, people who feel who think they are our friends, our allies, and our collaborators, people of consciousness. It's really up to everyone else to kind of find a way. You know, I come into these panels and I think of a call to action for people, because people want to be useful. People feel burdened by what they've seen on their TV screens in August. And I just tell people to think of this as the next 10 years. You know, today is the 20-year anniversary of the war. And hopefully it's an end of a chapter of U.S. military engagement. And hopefully there will be no more violence in Afghanistan. But there are many challenges ahead of us. You know, and so I think the success of 100,000 new Afghans in the United States is really dependent on the rest of us. How do we kind of plug in and build something that is sustainable, that is useful, that is constructive, that can be of service? If you're a mental health professional, how do you plug in? If you have a job as a community organizer, how do you play a constructive role over the next 3, 5, 10 years? And so my call to action to people is to just try to find a role. And that can be as simple as doing a donation drive to get warm clothes with the winter upcoming to military bases. But it's also about fighting climate justice. You know, that justice and that fight is also linked to the future of these new folks who are experiencing deep pain and trauma, but they're going to begin a new chapter of their life. And so I think their success is linked to how we step up and how we dedicate ourselves to what's coming in the next few years.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate that perspective. And last but not least, Nadia John, what does the future look like for the Afghan diaspora in the U.S. from your eyes?
You know, I don't want to repeat what has already been said. I agree so much with what we've been hearing, that I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. What we have been able to do in the last 5 weeks, as devastating as the situation has been, what we've been able to do is only because people within our community have been in positions where they've had the expertise, where they've had the knowledge, where they've had the networks, the connections, the capability, the finances, like all of it, to be able to make that happen. I mean, you mentioned also, you know, what are the strengths and challenges that our community is facing, and that's really going to help define what the future looks like. I think that, you know, I think of 2 strengths of our community: that we are stubborn, which may not sound like a strength, but when it's for a good purpose, it is really, really useful that we are stubborn, right? That we don't give up and we keep pushing and we keep asking tough questions, and we just don't see it. We don't see that this could be a negative for us. Like, we're going to be able to turn this around because we are just that stubborn. And the second is that we're really, really compelling. The world pays attention to us. It has been really because of the devastation in our history, in our ancestral history, in our national history, in our generational history. but we are compelling. And I think that's on a very granular level, it is Afghan people who make these stories compelling. So this is where I think, you know, we can take those strengths and use them to get over the challenges that we have. And I think one of our challenges that we do a bit of what I would call maybe like mental rubbernecking, where we internally kind of look at the devastation and we keep our eyes on the devastation, and that prevents us from moving forward. We've got to be able to move forward to what we can do, what we can accomplish, and what has been happening if we want to get to our goals. And it's easy to get lost in that rubbernecking because it is so overwhelming, right? All the negativity that is out there, all the challenges that are systemic, like the racism, like the xenophobia, all of those things, like the trauma and its impact on our psychosocial well-being. All of that is very real. And so, you know, how do we not feel overwhelmed by that? How do you not feel overwhelmed looking at what's happened in the last 5 weeks? Like some days it's really hard to even get out of bed and say, I'm going to actually accomplish anything today, because the scope of this tragedy is just enormous. But I think that we have to kind of train ourselves to be able to work around that if we want to get to that place where I think, you know, I agree with my two co-panelists that there is so much that is possible. We have seen it. We've gotten a real quick snapshot of it. We can kind of ink it and make it very, very real, but we just have to kind of keep moving with that same momentum.
Thank you. I think I'm watching the time. Maybe we can wrap up on this point. I'm looking at the questions from the YouTube. And yeah, right there it is. So for everyone, what kinds of things do you want to see from grassroots community coalitions that are trying to help the incoming families and are not part of the Afghan diaspora? I think we've talked a lot about how our own community can help, but if we're thinking about the bigger picture, there's so much that we can do to draw upon our allies. And how do you think it's best to do that? I guess Nadia John, since you went last, do you want to go first this time, and then we'll go the other way?
Sure. I think that, you know, engaging with these allies is really, really important. Like on Monday, my dad is going to be cooking soup on a live Zoom with an organization called KindWorks, and they've been doing Afghan recipes. And so people get on there and they follow whoever's cooking, and then they package whatever they've cooked in these large batches, and then that gets donated locally. And so this is a local organization, and then my dad's going to be doing it. And so that's going to go to the Afghan new arrivals. We're going to freeze the soup and deliver it so that folks will have some, you know, home cooked meals. So I think that, you know, we also have to be open-minded and engage with organizations. And sometimes it means that we take the first step, right? Because they may not know about us. They may not know that we exist. They may not be able to find us. But if we are engaged with our local communities, there are a lot of organizations. We have a lot of allies out there. You see the goodwill out there in the American public. So sometimes I think Afghans have to learn to take that first step and start being parts of these organizations that don't have Afghan on the name of them, and help build those bridges, because then when the crisis moments comes, like, we can then work together, and then they can do whatever they're doing they'll have some more culturally informed approaches because they have us with them, you know, doing this really good work.
Yeah, no, thank you. Arash, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I've spent some times, I get messages of desperation, but I also get dozens and dozens of messages of people who want to be useful from outside our community. And I think it's some light in these dark days. I think my advice is pretty straightforward. Find whatever your skill set is, and find whatever, like, toolbox. Look at your toolbox, look at what you have. And I would say show up to a local community or one of our organizations and say, you know, this is what I have to offer. You know, it can be a donation drive, it can be funding, it can be a skill set. You know, yesterday, members of the Iranian community reached out to me and they said, you know, we have Farsi schools. We are now offering, this is what we have to offer. It's education. And so they showed up with offer that's like almost concrete that we can just plug in. So I think, it's my advice, the same advice that I give to the Afghan diaspora folks who want to be really helpful. Find a good way to plug in and make it sustainable. Make it for the medium to long term, because this is a marathon. I think we found ourselves in this crisis moment, but find a constructive way and figure out how to plug in. And we're operating in past capacity a little bit, so we don't really have too much time to kind of like brainstorm what that looks like. But we will find a way to plug in your offers of help. And that also comes with centering and elevating Afghan voices, which is really critical in this moment.
And Dr. Alami, if you want to wrap up as well with your perspective, I think it'd be interesting to hear from you. What do you think, what do you want to see from grassroots or community coalitions that are trying to help incoming families that are not part of the Afghan diaspora?
Sure. Well, let me say that I want to echo my co-panelists' words here, and I don't have much interface with grassroots organizations. I'm somewhat aware of what resettlement agencies are doing for a lot of refugees that are newly resettling. But I will say, again, from a research perspective, is that, we want to move away from just assuming that people have mental health needs. I think if you link people, like John said, if people show up and present, their skill set and what they're capable of doing, and, ultimately linking people to various resources, whether that be things like just, helping people settle into their new home, to, finding ways of linking them to, educational resources or economic resources or jobs. So providing linkages to various community-based resources, I think, will facilitate that adjustment process. And, if community-based organizations, grassroots movements, focused more on this, then I think you can only expect success in such a situation.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. And I just want to take a moment to thank all of my co-panelists on here. It's a really, at least for me, it's been a very engaging discussion. And sometimes I feel like, an hour seems like a lot of time, but when you have three people that you want to ask so many things to and get into so much depth with, it passes by very quickly. So apologies if we didn't get into more depth than we wanted to, but I really do appreciate the time you've taken, the insights you've provided us. And just to recap for our audience, I think some takeaways from this conversation, we can really focus in on being empathetic, approaching the community with patience, truly listening to them, reaching out to existing organizations, working with the institutions and the structures that do exist, not being afraid of approaching those spaces, but at the same time, also not being afraid to speak our own voice, to be true to who we are, and being vocal in that. And then finally, we can't, I think this is something that you all have underscored a lot, is the power of support, of true, empathetic, sincere support. There's nothing like it. And I hope that the momentum that we've had and seeing the coalition building that's happening, I'm so grateful that we do have the research that we do from folks like Dr. Alami to be able to build off of and have a place to know which direction to take many times. But for folks who are outside of the Afghan community, there's Coalition Afghan is the larger organization that I just didn't mention the name of, that AAF, Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, and several other organizations have come together under this umbrella to do a lot of this amazing work. And individually, if you felt like you resonated with any of them, also feel free to reach out to them. I know they're very receptive and always open to volunteers or open to answering questions. Do not hesitate to do so. But thank you so much once again to all of our panelists. This amazing discussion. And I'm very hopeful that if the diaspora looks like anything like this YouTube panel right here, it's the sky's the limit, really, and what we could look like.
Thank you.
Oh, Omar, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you all so much again. for speaking to us tonight. This was, I'm so grateful to have heard from all of you. I follow everyone here, their work very closely, and I am a huge fan. So I'm very thankful that they took the time to come and to join us today. I wanted to close by just thanking everybody who's tuned in throughout this week. All the folks that have been able to participate in our symposium this week. We have done our best to try to really center Afghan voices during this time, during this difficult time for a lot of people, and this moment of I know a lot of important reflection and thinking about what these past 20 years have meant for the people of Afghanistan and those of us who are outside of it in the US and elsewhere. So I wanted to just encourage everybody to please check out the previous, every day we had a keynote. At 12 o'clock, we had a panel, 12 o'clock Pacific, and then at 6 o'clock Pacific, we had a panel. So we had a keynote at 12, panel at 6. So we had 2 sessions every day that I encourage you all to check out and encourage you all to watch. You can watch it on YouTube. You can follow us on social media and check out all of our work and all of the things that we've been doing at MESC-UCR. So I encourage everybody to check that out. You can find all the information and all the previous sessions and all the previous videos from this past week. And then I also want to encourage everybody to please support Afghan scholars at risk to come to UC Riverside. So I encourage you all to help us in supporting to bring 2 Afghan scholars at our university and giving them the support and the money they need to transition and to live comfortably and to continue their education and research here at UCR. So once again, I want to thank all the panelists from tonight, all the panelists from this past week, and the folks that have joined us. And thank you all for tuning in. Please continue these conversations and have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you, everyone.